Okay, well, it looks like we're live once again. Welcome to everyone that's watching right now and anyone who might be watching later. I am Becca Keller, Director of Analysis, and I am joined today by my colleague, our senior analyst, Matthew Bay. And we thought, given that we're both sitting in Texas in the middle of another ice storm, thankfully with power this time, that we'd go ahead and talk about a overarching topic of climate change and geopolitics. So Matthew, I feel like in all of our decade of working together, this has been a topic that's been there the entire time. And it's very slow moving. Obviously, it's the climate. But what right now is really dynamic in your mind in terms of this intersection?
Yeah, so I mean, it really has been a very, a subject that has, gone from, a question of denial to more people now realizing, okay, it's time to do something. Now, there's
Mhm.
very big disagreements on what to do. You look at, the climate activists, they're looking at what happened at COP26 last year. They're like, that wasn't enough. Countries are just making these vague promises that may or may not come true. Companies are doing the same thing. But what we are at a point right now is that if you look over the last, say, 2 or 3 years, in a lot of the emissions intensive industries, we've had companies come out with their 2050 pledges, in some cases 2030 pledges, things like that. But now it's the question of the nuts and bolts of how do you actually put into place a business model or a intermediate goals to actually achieve those longer term goals. Do you, in the case of, for example, BP, the British petroleum company, they're looking at cutting oil and gas production pretty substantially over the next decade as a way to actually hit those things. So I think we're really moving into how do you deal with such a crisis? And of course, that opens up the whole can of worms and a whole different areas of where is what are going to be enough, basically. So it really
Right,
is a
right.
action point.
And even if it is enough, the next 20 years or so are pretty set in terms of what we're going to see in terms of changes, more extreme weather events, all of that. So how does that increased uncertainty really change the political calculus of major actors?
Well, for
Like,
countries, I think it's more about looking at ways to ensure to put into place these I guess socially okay programs, whether it be looking at what is the balance between economic development and combating climate change. In some
mhm.
countries like the West, we have a little bit more financial freedom to do things like moving towards electricity cars before they might reach full cost parity, at least for a new
Yeah.
buy. With electric vehicles, whereas places like India or South Africa or even China to some degree, that's just not an easy sell for them in many ways. So I think it is really finding that right balance, which is really difficult to do.
No, for sure. Absolutely. It's always that, because it is such a slow moving trend, getting that political will and that action in place. And that's what we ran into with COP26. And there was this huge push to get those promises out there. But then now what happens? We don't have that same impetus. And you're saying it's coming from the consumer, it's coming from the investor. Um, but going back to the geopolitics is all about geography. So let's look at the geographic place where this is changing the most, and that overlaps with one of the places where you do a lot of coverage for us, and that's the Arctic and the energy sector. So with an opening of the Arctic, how does that change the dynamics of the energy field at a time when everyone's moving away from oil and gas? Like, how does the Arctic play out in climate change?
Yeah, so the Arctic is one of those things where a decade ago everybody was like, okay, Arctic oil and gas is going to be a very significant thing for our long-term energy security here in the United States.
Hmm.
In Russia, they were looking at it as the long-term ability to sustain their production. However, as we've seen, you can make the argument that we've actually seen kind of the energy transition, accelerate to some degree than what people probably initially thought of in terms of reaching cost parity for some technologies. And then the U.S. domestic shale revolution, and then of course similar plays elsewhere. Maybe it's not as necessarily as needed as it once thought as was in terms of the longer term development. So you've seen a back off from it, but at the same time, you are still seeing countries that have a less concern or not like concern or at least a less focus on climate change. They are the ones that are rapidly moving, of course, more towards that. Russia is still, of course, eyeing those offshore reserves. China is looking into ways to invest in the Arctic, etc. But there is, I guess, more of a question as to is it necessarily needed to the same degree, or is the oil we have elsewhere and gas we have elsewhere, sufficient or not? And I think that's really something that the environmentalists are probably going to at least like, because it means that there's less willing or less ability or less financially makes sense to do some of these Arctic drilling projects and has alternatives elsewhere. Especially as you think about it, outside of China and I guess parts of and Russian companies, only companies from the U.S. and Europe really have the technical capability to do some of those massive projects, and some of them, like a BP, like a Shell, are looking at ways, to really reduce their emissions. Maybe that's not a project they're going to be investing in, except for maybe in some, isolated cases like, the North Sea or Norwegian Sea.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, like, so shifting gears, the Arctic and that high technology thing, that's still going to be an issue for shipping and who controls the Arctic. That's a whole
Yes.
nother live Facebook Live we could do there on that topic. We should probably get Roger in on that one. But we definitely see China moving to act as sort of a global voice in this climate change discussion. And as the chasm between the developed and the developing world really grows, in the ability to combat climate change, the ability to mitigate, the ability to plan ahead, just from sheer funds. What do you think China is going to, what's China's next move? How does China keep positioning themselves as a world leader in this area?
So I think I would answer that in a couple of different ways. One, I think we all have to recognize that from an economic or an energy rebalancing process, China's the world's consumer of coal, basically. That is a massive undertaking, and asking China to be able to make that same shift that the way that the Western countries can do is probably a little bit too much, particularly when you consider that a lot of the inland parts of China, they are not as developed as the coastal regions of China. It really is a country that is dealing with internal economic imbalances that it has to navigate and has to think about when it does do its energy transition. So I think when they say things like we want to reduce our emissions by 2060, I think they're sincere, but they're very much concerned about that domestic consequences of moving too fast. And they are so there's that element of it. And then I think there's also then the strategic, commercial and competition when it comes to manufacturing of tech and development of technology that can be used either to accelerate the energy transition. China's investing heavily in green technology, as we all know, but also mitigation tools down the road. The other thing that I think that China is viewing as an opportunity. So as the U.S. and as the West, a number of different Western countries, for example, at COP26, they pledged to curb their fossil fuel outward investment into other countries. China is looking at that probably as an opportunity, recognizing that countries in Africa, countries in Southeast Asia, et cetera, they're not the world's biggest emitters right now in many cases, and they are in some cases the poorest countries. Maybe we have an opportunity to strengthen our connections to those governments by doing things like a coal project or a natural gas project or something like that, and help finance that. Whereas Western companies and Western governments aren't willing to do that as much.
Right, soft power diplomacy. So they're playing that game
Yeah.
on that end, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the control and the continued leadership in the lithium ion battery industry. I mean, the sheer control from mine all the way to assembly of the batteries. China's got that massively covered in terms of their participation. So that also is a strategic advantage for them that we expect continued involvement in Latin America because of that aspect of the energy transition. So Europe, I'm going to keep bouncing around the globe here, but Europe, it really has positioned themselves as a unit in terms of global leadership on climate change technology, climate change behavior. But what kind of constraints they have? We see the sort of reticence they have to push fully back against Russia in this current situation with Russia, Ukraine, and that's really a lot about natural gas. So is natural gas a green energy for Europe? And if so, how does that dependence on Russia play into their whole
Right.
ability to be a world leader on climate change?
Yeah, so really, Europe is finding themselves in a conundrum right now where they're dealing with, escalating natural gas prices, escalating energy prices, all of these things that are problematic for, European consumers, European households, things like that, and companies, of course. But they've recently decided that both nuclear, which is probably easier to classify as a green technology, and natural gas, can be, a safe or clean technology, at least for the energy transition when it comes to their taxonomy. That doesn't mean it can't change down the road, but I think what it is it's a realization that, again, even in Europe, you can't, you know, flip the switch overnight and say everything is going to be green, this is going to be green, blah, blah, blah. You need to have that actionable kind of process to get to that end state. So when you're looking at the European Union, we talked about earlier how, you know, this is now this time of what is the realistic plan that you can actually do to achieve those 2030 and 2050 goals. They're realizing that natural gas is a bridge fuel that you kind of have if you want to have, you know, a dramatic reduction of emissions by 2030. You have to basically transition, you know, coal to natural gas, use natural gas instead of oil. So it really is essential to that kind of, you know, hitting those medium-term goals, which a lot of governments, if you think about it now, it's 2022, Becca. It's only 8 years now until 2030, which is kind of, you know, crazy to think about. But, you know, a lot of these politicians, you know, in 2010, they wouldn't have been looking at their own political futures and saying 2030 is a realistic thing where I might be in office or I might be, you know, running for office. Now, 2022, they are. So, you know, they really do have to think about, okay, what is that concrete plan? Natural gas in the European eyes, it seems to be something that at least most European countries are realizing we need to use that for that bridge fuel technology, at least until the mid 2030s. After that, maybe they'll rewrite the rules for the taxonomy to remove it to be a little bit more, I guess, real in a sense. But that's, you know, a decade away or so.
Right, which makes it, you know, hard to predict, but that's what we do here. One final question from me for you, and it goes back to that sort of concreteness. Where do we see sort of carbon taxes and carbon trading and that concept, and how to, you know, that taking hold the best? And does it work? Does it really have an effect on reducing emissions?
So I think it definitely can have an impact on reducing emissions. But I think we are starting to see a lot of governments looking at a way to link the ones that have set up carbon trading markets, starting to link those, and also at the same time, starting to look at ways to have carbon taxes, which would be, you know, on border taxes, you know, basically tariffs where you're exporting from a country that doesn't have as much climate change related and emissions related standards at home. I think that from the Western perspective, you know, we have seen, you know, a number of Western governments, particularly the U.S., to be honest, putting into place a little bit more economic nationalist policies and protectionism. This fits right into that, the idea that if we're going to be doing anything on climate change, even if it's the U.S. and the EU aren't going to go as aggressive as many people want, they're still going to be looking at, okay, if China isn't going as aggressive, how do I protect myself against China from getting an advantage from this? I think that carbon tariffs or carbon taxes are some sort of a mechanism to deal with that. Is something that over the next, you know, 10, 15, 20 years is going to be adopted by several countries. And there's going to be, you know, trade disputes over it, all those kinds of things that we've seen, you know, really over the last 5 years kind of, you know, blow up. That's all going to be happening. However, what I think is also important to realize is that there's this other aspect of it, which is probably going to be, you know, carbon related financial instruments that are, you know, more readily traded on stock exchanges and things like that, beyond just your traditional markets like the European Union, et cetera. So you have in Singapore, for example, you know, people starting to set up the trading of natural-based solutions, which are basically investing in like trees, basically. But what the point being, though, is that can offset some of the carbon emissions. But if you think about it, if you are a company that's operating in an emissions-intensive sector, buying those to then sell a carbon-free good can be something that you can look at least point to and saying, look, we are trying to do what we can do to reduce emissions, even though we know that our fuel or whatever, or our product is, you know, creating some emissions. We are trying to offset that. So what we've seen really over the last couple of years, like in the oil and gas sector, is a lot of, quote, carbon-free natural gas or carbon-free oil, where they are buying and investing in some of these different plants to kind of, you know, offset some of those emissions. And I think, you know, moving forward, when you start talking about carbon capture and carbon storage, then you can kind of make the same kind of an argument that I am taking at least some of that and I'm putting it into storage. Now, will it ever probably, you know, be truly green oil? Of course not. But it is a realization that these oil companies are trying to reduce their emissions intensities. They are trying to reduce their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. These are ways to at least for them and to make progress on that and or at least show a commitment to that. Of course, the environmentalists are going to be saying it's just fudging the numbers, basically.
Not enough.
But it is at least a concrete way that they are trying to do it.
No, that makes complete sense. I mean, we can talk about climate change, impact on geopolitics for hours, but I think, you know, at this point, it has been wonderful talking to the live crew yet again. If you want to hear more or read more about what we have to say here at RANE, feel free to subscribe. Our address is ranenetwork.com, and you can log into our geopolitical, cyber, safety and security, and legal and regulatory risks. Thank you all.